It's great to be joined today by Sarah Kendzior, a journalist who focuses on politics, the economy, and media. She's a regular contributor to The Globe and Mail. You wrote this great article, Sarah, in The Correspondent called "Our Fate Was Sealed Long Before November 8th," relating, of course, to the election of Donald Trump on November 8th. Let me just first get a general sense from you. What did you mean by that? What suggested to you that the fate was sealed prior to the election?
Well, in that article, I was talking about structural problems in the United States that predate the election and that were exacerbated by the campaigns during the election. In particular, I was talking about racism, white mob violence, conspiracy theories, attacks on freedom of the press, the allure of demagoguery, all these sort of things that we've seen emerging during the Trump campaign. When I wrote it, most people thought that Clinton was going to win the election. I was always less sure of that, despite the polls, because I live in Missouri and I was witnessing what was happening around me, and I saw these structural trends in action. And so I kind of felt like either way, whether Trump won or whether Clinton won, we were going to be dealing with potential violence, with racist violence, white mob violence, hate crimes, and that's indeed what happened after Trump won. The only question in my mind was whether those sorts of crimes would be sanctioned by the incoming administration, as I do believe they are by Trump, or whether they would be opposed, as I think they would have been under Clinton.
So let's dig into that a little. I mean, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are in terms of the sanctioning, because on paper, Donald Trump gave this insanely tepid, please stop type of comment, I think, during his first 60 Minutes interview when he was told about the violence that was taking place. At the same time, we are seeing the selection to Donald Trump's cabinet and advisors of individuals with a sort of spotty past with regard to everything from race relations to understanding sort of the real differences between different socioeconomic classes in the United States. Give me a sense of what you're seeing from Trump that you would sort of call sanctioning of that type of violence or discrimination.
Well, I could just, to go to the points that you just made, Trump has the opportunity to call out, racism, bigotry, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, all the things that we've seen happening in a very forceful way. I know personally, if someone were running around the country screaming my name and then spray painting swastikas or beating up little Muslim children, I would be worried about that. I'd be personally offended by that. And if I were in a position of power, I would certainly do all I could to stop that in order to protect people. He doesn't seem to want to do that. Protecting American people is not a priority for him. And so he's been, very passive. He's letting it happen. I think he knows that, it helps to have this kind of mob response should something go wrong. I don't think that the people doing this are really representative of most Trump supporters, but I do think that Trump has an obligation when people are committing acts of violence in his name to call them out. But then you look at the cabinet, you look at the selection of people like Jeff Sessions, for example, who has a long history of racism, or Michael Flynn, and generally speaking, a cabinet that in particular is very anti-Muslim, is very Islamophobic. And then you look at, Trump's own campaign with endorsements by the KKK and by, other white supremacists, extremists, who he never really denounces and who have certainly helped his cause and contributed to him. I don't think he has any interest in stopping this. He's aligned even with foreign white supremacists abroad, with a growing movement, including people like Nigel Farage, Vladimir Putin, who has hosted white supremacists in Russia for training and guidance. So I think that this is something he wants. Sometimes he's pretty overt about it. Most of the time, he just kind of tries to dodge the issue or make it seem like it's not of foremost importance to him, but it's certainly beneficial to him. And I don't see him, honoring that moral obligation or presidential obligation to protect vulnerable citizens who are the victims of these crimes.
In a second, I want to dig in a little bit to the anti-Semitism aspect of this. But before we do that, based on the cabinet picks and advisors you've seen so far, I think that there's sort of an implicit sense when we see the past statements of many of these individuals. You mentioned Jeff Sessions, you mentioned Flynn, et cetera. There's a sort of sense that this is not going to be good for marginalized groups. But I'm curious what you would see in terms of the actual governmental actions that might be taken by these individuals in terms of policy, what potentially is most concerning to you, and by which cabinet member? I mean, we could look at Jeff Sessions and the war on drugs, for example. We could look at Ben Carson and housing policy. But what's most concerning to you?
I mean, everything is concerning to me, and the reason I say everything is because I think it's connected. I think Trump's goal is maybe a little bit different than his advisors, but Trump's goal is to build a kleptocracy that's going to benefit his family, that's going to strip the country down for parts and use it to benefit his own personal finances and wealth, and that's been going on this whole time. So I think that that's what's in it for Trump. I think that the cabinet has other objectives in mind. I think that some of this is extending that. He's built a cabinet of billionaires, of financiers, of elite Silicon Valley people backing him, of media empires like Breitbart backing him, all of whom are going to want a piece of this pie. And so that goes hand in hand. But then you have to sort of connect that desire for personal wealth, that kleptocratic desire, with an attack on civil liberties and civil rights. And I think that, I suppose marginalized people is a good way to put it, because it's a very broad category in terms of whose rights I think will be taken away. You already see a clampdown on voter rights. You saw that this year for Black Americans, many of whom struggled to vote but couldn't under new voter ID laws. You see plans for a Muslim registry. That's something I'm very worried about. Some people blow it off, but they've shown every indication that they want to follow through. As I said, it's a uniformly, anti-Muslim cabinet. And if you look at the history of what happens when you start a registry, generally it leads to camps and often to ethnic cleansing. And there have been many attacks on Muslims since the Trump campaign launched. So I think you'll have both sanctioned and unsanctioned forms of violence. You've seen anti-Semitic attacks. A lot of Jewish journalists have been attacked by Trump fans throughout the campaign in often, very hostile and frightening ways. I'm trying to think of a group that won't be hurt. Mike Pence is a terrible person for gays and lesbians. You'll see attacks on abortion rights, which will affect women. You'll see attacks on, even the rights of children. They want to take away the ability of kids to get, breakfast and lunch in Title I schools. So, I really don't think that, and also the elderly, if you want to go into Medicare or Medicaid, like, I don't think there's a group that is going to not be hurt by this, except for, the most privileged, wealthy, elite group of white men. I think even, there's this sort of myth of the Trump voter as a struggling working class white man. I don't think that myth is really borne out in voting data. They're definitely white people, but of all different classes. But I think they will be hurt as well. The folks in Missouri, where I live, who voted for him, I think will already, they will be hurt. Like what he did with Boeing yesterday, which is a big provider of employment in St. Louis, is potentially very harmful for folks who may have voted for him. So basically, we're all in trouble when the president's main interest is himself, and he's devoid of conscience, and his administration is as well, and is, flippant almost in their treatment of marginalized and vulnerable people. Then we're in deep trouble as a country.
Sarah, last thing I want to touch on, and next week we're going to have a former neo-Nazi to comment on this. With regard to the anti-Semitism aspect of everything that's been going on, we've seen this support of Trump from white nationalists, former KKK, right? I mean, like we've not seen for a presidential candidate in a very long time. Why do you think they're giving him a pass on the reality that he has a Jewish daughter, a Jewish son-in-law that clearly is a very close and trusted advisor, Jewish grandchildren? How are these individuals rationalizing that away in their support for Trump?
I mean, I think that they see Trump as the key to a bigger goal. And so they're willing to overlook that, especially since Jared Kushner is a key player in bringing this goal forward, as is Sheldon Adelson and other Jewish backers of Trump. I think it's really unfortunate. You can just judge a person by their actions and not their affinities. And when Jewish journalists and Jewish citizens are being attacked, then there's a moral obligation to speak up against that. So I don't think it's good enough to say, oh, Trump can't be anti-Semitic, or his team can't be anti-Semitic because he happens to have, a Jewish son-in-law and a daughter who converted to Judaism.
Hmm.
They're not doing anything as Jews to stop these sorts of attacks on fellow Jews. And I think that is, what you should look at and judge, because just like Trump, they could be doing a lot to stop this kind of hateful rhetoric, to denounce groups like the Ku Klux Klan, and to denounce other anti-Semitic groups, and they're not doing it. So it just shows it's not a priority for them, and I think that's very unfortunate.
We've been speaking with Sarah Kendzior. We started talking about her article, Our Fate Was Sealed, long before November 8th, but she's written more since then as well, and I encourage you to check out her work. Sarah, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.